All right, folks. So for our next portion, we need to go back to our masking now that that's dry. Use a small piece of masking tape. And place it over both the white and the colored areas. Now we're also going to try something called masking fluid, which is a material that you paint onto the surface, and it will block the paint from going down onto the paper. So you want to use a brush that's not in great shape, because this can ruin a brush. And just paint some marks, something that looks like it was done with a paintbrush. Clean the brush out immediately after use. If you let that masking fluid sit on the brush, it will ruin it. Next, you're going to try using a ruling pen. And this is a pen that you can dip into the masking fluid and then use it to draw lines or write words. So make some squiggly lines. You can write a word or two if you want. Make some shapes. And now you have to let that dry. Clean the ruling pen out immediately also. It's just difficult to clean once that masking fluid dries inside. Now let's go back to lifting. Begin by taking clean water on your brush and just paint a shape over both the yellow and the blue areas, again using clean water. This will reactivate the paint, and you can take a dry paper towel and lift that activated paint back off of the surface. And you can see with the light colors that it lifts off pretty well. But with that darker blue, it's going to leave some staining. So this isn't a foolproof way of erasing something, but if you need to try an area over again, you can wet it, lift it, and try again. Now let's try lifting with a brush. So take a clean brush, make sure it's super duper clean. Have some water on it. Shouldn't be dripping wet, but it should be wet. And draw on the surface with that wet brush. And remember, brushes absorb liquid. So I can kind of use the brush like a sponge to lift that color back off. So you'll notice I brush with water and then immediately brush it off into my paper towel. So I'm taking the material off and putting it onto the paper towel. So see how I brush, wipe, brush, and then wipe. And that can be a more precise way of lifting the paint off. Okay, now let's return to glazing. Once our glazing layer is dry, you're going to mix up a dark color. And you want it to be pretty thin. I'm trying to mix up a gray here. And the black paint in this set is very green, so I added some red to it to dull it down. And I'm going to paint across my light and dark colors. And this is called a glaze of light, very thin. It's not light colored, it's a thin layer. And you can see that I can still see that yellowy green color as well as the dark green color underneath. But I'm adding a glaze of gray on top. And we'll come back to that and do more in a few minutes. Now let's try the light to dark area. Begin by adding clean water all the way from the top to the bottom. Mix up a dark color. I'm using a mixture of purple, adding some blue, and I'll start with a wash over the whole surface. At the bottom where I want it to be light, I'm not going to add color. I'm going to start with, or just add water to lighten it. And then I will build up my darkness from top. For the value landscape, begin with a very light, pale layer of a color, any color you want, and allow it. After it dries, add a layer of a slightly darker value color, and then let that dry. While it dries, you can go back to your masking area and apply a glaze on top of all your masking materials. And then let it dry. You can apply another layer of glaze over your glazing area as well, just to see what happens when you add multiple layers. When your value landscape layer is dry, add a third, darker layer of You can add a fourth layer, even darker. Now let's move on to that night sky. Start again with a layer of clean water. You don't have to go all the way to the bottom of the box. You can go about 3/4 of the way down. And mix up a light yellowy orange color. You want it to be a golden color. We always start with our lightest values in watercolor. In acrylic, we worked from front to back. From back to front. And with watercolor, it's a little different. You work from light to dark. So on the bottom half of my water, I'm going to add a layer of yellow. I'm going to be transitioning to a blue-violet kind of color, so I want to put some red in between. Because going from yellow to violet will give us mud. Now I'll take my blue-violet and add that at the top of my box. Let the colors flow and blend together. See how they change over time? Watercolor paintings are always changing until they are dry. You can get pretty saturated with this area. We want a nighttime sky, so we do want it nice and dark at the top. And notice how I'm just sort of lightly dropping the color onto that surface. I'm not brushing it too much, letting it be loose, flow together. See how the colors interact with each other. I want to go back one more time to my value landscape with something really dark with almost no water mixed into it. This paint should feel sticky. I'll add my very darkest value all the way down at the bottom. And it's okay to let it cross over some of the other values to give it more depth. My right hand side is a little empty, so I'm going to add one last hill over here. Next, we're going to go to the realistic landscape. You should be working from the photograph available on our class webpage, and you can just watch me do this quickly. This will take you 30-40 minutes to do this one painting. But I start lightly with my sky, leaving some white behind for the clouds. And again, I want to make sure I'm working from light to dark. So my colors are very pale from the beginning. And then I begin to build in the shadows. Making sure to observe the picture the whole time. Lastly, you can add some evergreen trees to your night sky. It gives it a really neat aurora borealis effect. So mix up a dark green black and add some trees. Just use horizontal lines. I always brush from left to right, so not back and forth, just one stroke over, pick up your brush. Okay, now that our masking fluid is dry, I can peel the tape off and see that tape will block the paint. So this is great for borders or particularly large areas in a painting. And then our masking fluid has blocked out the smaller, more detailed things. And notice that we could use masking fluid or tape on top of straight paper to leave white, or we can use it on top of painted areas. In this case, we left yellow, but you could use it to block off any area that you don't want to get paint on. For the last portion of this worksheet, you're going to go to the Google Slides presentation on the step-by-step on how to do this. So this is watercolor light to dark, and this is the most complicated of the mini paintings that you'll be doing. Here's a reference photo, and you're going to first add masking fluid in your first layer of very light, kind of a yellowy color, and then slowly build up with darker values, darker, darker, darkest. Okay, so slowly work your way through this step-by-step image.